Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of the Kharkiv region, where the Russians, following assaults that I reported on in my previous video, they successfully reached the village of Lypci. In this push, they managed to move all the way from Lukyansk to Lypci, making use of several routes. The first one is directly to the north of Lukyansk through the river line and directly towards Lypci from that direction. The second one is through that same route but further south through the forest patches, and a third route through the southern parts of the river line in between these two first routes and this third route, where the Russians have not reached as far. All of this was confirmed with this geolocated footage of fighting taking place on the outskirts of Lypci and here in the southern parts. This shows that the Russians are pushing in multiple directions. At the same time, there is a push coming to the north from the village of Lypci through the main road between Lypci and Lypci, and a fighting is taking place here to the west in the Dacha area north of Lypci. So with this, we are seeing that the Russians are pushing from every direction from Lypci and Lukyansk towards Lypci from all of their different roads. And with that, the Battle of Lypci has officially begun with this Russian storming of the town. This town of Lypci here in this section of the front line is similar to that of Vovchansk to the east. The Ukrainians have very high significance to this village as it is strategically important, both being south of the lake here to the north of it, allowing for a strong flank to whoever controls it in the eastern parts, as well as the significant location and its closeness to Kharkiv, where whoever occupies Lypci is able to have Kharkiv within the range of ordinary artillery. At the same time, it is connected to the Ukrainian second line of defense, where there were supposed to be dragon teeth and anti-tank ditches, but there was never built any, or what was built was significantly underwhelming due to the corruption of Ukrainian officials, and this has made it much easier for the Russians to reach this point and fight through it to storm the town. And this also means that the Russian positions, once if they capture the town, would be significantly improved in this section of the front line, and they can develop it in the direction of Vesele further south to attack village after village towards Kharkiv and to stabilize the western flank to allow the Russians to have a strong flank here to the west and focus entirely on the south and east of these positions, limiting the Ukrainian ability to direct forces to the area and strengthening the Russian positions in the area. This advance spans about 10 square kilometers. Moving on to the next section in direction of Vovchansk, the Russians have advanced significantly in the northern parts. As I mentioned in my previous video, the Russians launched a flanking maneuver here to the east and in the central parts and western parts, where they, through this flanking maneuver, operationally encircled the Ukrainian forces in the eastern parts of the northern parts of the town. This has led to the Ukrainians withdrawing from it to the central parts and has allowed the Russians to capture a significant portion of Vovchansk, pushing the Ukrainians to the final parts in the northern section, which is here in between the Vovcha River to the east and to the west. This makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to their positions here in the northern section, and the Russians will likely capture it very soon, having this wedge into Ukrainian territory. We'll likely see that the Russians will focus their attention on the northern bank of the river, where they pretty much control the entirety of it from Staritsia all the way to the east here by Tichy. This allows Russians to have a significant portion of the front line under their control along the river line, which means that they can cross over from any of these points, and such a crossing would be very dangerous, but if the Russians succeed with it, they could destabilize the Ukrainian positions and likely take Ukrainian positions across. This will likely be in combination with heavy artillery preparations. However, what we do not take into account is the expansion of the Russian offensive in this section of the front line. Currently, we're seeing in the direction of Kharkiv that this is just a reconnaissance party. What was estimated to be about 4,000 soldiers is what the Russians are using here in the section of the front line. This makes it a very limited scope of an offensive. However, we are seeing a lot of information that this could change very soon. The Russians are sending reinforcements such as this video here near the front line, near the border area between Russia and Ukraine, and this indicates that there is a buildup of Russian troops. At the same time, we have seen that the Russians have faced a lot of success with this operation, capturing over 250 square kilometers with just 4,000 soldiers. This means that there is a high possibility that the Russians are able to launch a successful offensive. With that in mind, the Russian command is likely to expand such an offensive as long as they have the necessary units available. The Russians have a concentration of troops along the entirety of the northern section of the front line. Whether they will launch further reconnaissance missions into Sumy and Chernihiv, similar to that of the one in Kharkiv, or they'll expand the offensive in Kharkiv, or simply launch a massive offensive elsewhere, we do not know. But it is very likely that they will launch some sort of operation, whether it be in the Bryansk, Kursk, or Belgrade region towards Chernihiv, Sumy, or Kharkiv. We know for sure that the Russians are building up a significant amount of troops in the northern section, and at the same time are developing their offensive operations in the south and in the east. This shows that the Russians are entering an active phase of the war after almost 2 years of almost entirely positional fighting and battle of attrition. The Russians are now switching their tactics completely to an active phase of the war, and will likely see significant movement of territory in the coming weeks. For example, there is this article here by Reuters. Kiev, whose shortages of manpower have been compounded by delays to Western arms supplies, has warned that Russia may be preparing for a big offensive in the coming weeks. It has flagged a Russian buildup of small units near its Sumy region. Pasi Poranian, an analyst with the Blackbird Group, told Reuters that Moscow's Kharkiv push looked aimed at drawing in Kiev's limited reserves into battle before the main summer offensive begins. If Ukraine overcommits in Kharkiv and Sumy, they may preserve some territory there, perhaps prevent Kharkiv civilians from suffering artillery bombardments, perhaps even push back the enemy back to the border, he said. But it may cost them the war if the reserves are not available to respond to crises during the Russian summer offensive. He's saying that the Ukrainians should not overcommit in the Kharkiv region, as if they do that, the Russians can open up a separate front, and that could collapse the entirety of the Ukrainian lines. The current Ukrainian strategy is to try and hold and plug the gap of any Russian assault, as any loss of territory is a sign of weakness, and the Ukrainians do not want to look weak because, as such, the Western morale to send weapons to Ukraine would devolve, and the Ukrainians would have a hard time arguing that they're able to actually win the war and not negotiate for peace. This, however, has faced the Ukrainians with massive difficulties because of their limited reserves. Previously, the Ukrainians would have multiple layers of defensive lines, they would have multiple layers of fortifications, and multiple layers of infantry to hold the line in case a Russian group made a breakthrough somewhere at the front. For example, in the direction of Ocheretine, where the Russians took control over the village and then advanced into multiple directions. This has proven to give the Russians significant parts of territory and advances. However, it is still very limited. Compared to the Kharkiv region, the advances the Russians made northwest of Avdiivka are insignificant in size. This, however, changed with the Russians' attack in Kharkiv. This showed that the Ukrainians did not have several layers of defense and defensive positions and manpower. Instead, they were left with little, and this forced the Ukrainians to send reserves to establish proper defensive lines. This, however, can be explained in the sense that the Ukrainians have their frontline defenses, and then their second line was sent to Kharkiv. In that sense, if the Russians now launch an assault and make a breakthrough in Ukrainian lines in the south, there will be no second line. Therefore, the emphasis of the Blackbird guy is that if the Ukrainians defend everywhere and end up spreading their forces thin across the whole front, then if the Russians launch an offensive and break through these lines, they could encircle a significant portion of Ukrainian forces and capture significant territories, significantly weakening the Ukrainian forces and country as a whole, leading to the Ukrainians losing the war. So they do not really come up with a solution because the Ukrainian situation is very difficult, which makes it very difficult for them to actually judge the situation correctly and provide the correct choices. And is also limited to how much they can actually save. They may have to give up significant portions of territory to create a better defensive line, for example withdrawing across the Dnieper River. But that is such a massive defeat that the Ukrainians would never take that choice, even if it may be the best one. In conclusion, what we're seeing is not the massive Russian offensive. It is not a major push. This is simply a reconnaissance force that has been more successful than the Ukrainian summer offensive by itself. And this will likely change as the Russian main force, the main push, and a massive offensive will likely take place. Whether it is tomorrow or in a few weeks, we don't know. Where it will be, we don't know. But what we do know is that it is coming. And just like I expected the Kharkiv offensive and predicted it would come, it is likely that this will come as well. And that is where my prediction lies. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.